You know that sinking feeling when he stops texting you goodnight the way he used to, even though nothing has apparently changed between you. One moment he's planning weekend getaways and meeting your friends. The next he's too busy to confirm dinner plans you made days ago. Here's what most women don't realize. According to attachment research, 40% of men display avoidant patterns that make them simultaneously crave and fear emotional intimacy. Popular dating advice tells you this means he's just not that into you, or that you should give him space to miss you. But Jung's groundbreaking research into the masculine psyche reveals something far more complex and painful. These men often love deeply whilst being psychologically incapable of translating that love into commitment. The conventional wisdom about commitment-phobic men is completely wrong, and this misunderstanding keeps women trapped in cycles of confusion and self-blame. Most relationship experts focus on behavior modification or communication techniques, but Jung discovered that commitment issues stem from unconscious psychological splits that no amount of having the talk can resolve. These aren't men who are playing games or keeping their options open. They're men whose unconscious minds have learned to associate deep love with psychological danger. When you understand what Jung called the anima projection and how it creates internal warfare in the masculine psyche, everything about his hot and cold behavior suddenly makes sense. By the end of this video, you'll recognize exactly why he can look you in the eyes and say he loves you, whilst simultaneously sabotaging any possibility of real partnership. Jung discovered that men who exhibit this pattern are living what he termed a psychological split between their conscious romantic desires and their unconscious terror of engulfment. These men genuinely believe they want committed relationships. They're not consciously manipulating or deceiving you. However, their unconscious mind harbors what Jung called the negative mother complex, where childhood experiences created internal programming that equates emotional intimacy with loss of self. When such a man meets a woman who triggers his deeper feelings, his conscious mind experiences genuine love and attraction, but his unconscious immediately activates protective mechanisms. This creates the maddening contradiction you experience. A man who can plan your future together on Saturday and go emotionally distant by Wednesday. The root of this split often lies in early relationships with maternal figures who, whilst not necessarily abusive, created dynamics where love came with conditions or where independence was subtly discouraged. Jung observed that boys who experienced smothering maternal energy, whether through overprotection, emotional manipulation, or love that required them to sacrifice their authentic selves, develop unconscious associations between intimacy and psychological death. Their young psyche learned that to be loved meant to disappear, to have their boundaries violated, to lose their essential masculine identity. These patterns become deeply embedded in what Jung called the personal unconscious, operating entirely outside adult awareness, but powerfully influencing romantic behavior. When these men fall in love as adults, their unconscious mind interprets the vulnerability and interdependence as existential threats. This psychological structure explains why commitment-phobic men often become most distant immediately after your most intimate moments together. It's not that intimacy itself repels them. Quite the opposite. The deeper the connection they feel, the more their unconscious alarm systems activate, warning them of impending psychological annihilation. Jung noted that these men often experience physical anxiety symptoms when relationships become too real. Difficulty sleeping, restlessness, sudden urges to travel or change jobs. Their unconscious mind is literally preparing for escape, even as their conscious mind wants to stay. This internal war manifests as mixed messages, future faking, and the exhausting pattern of acting completely committed whilst refusing to acknowledge the relationship's reality. Understanding this dynamic can save you months of wondering what you did wrong or how you could have been different. What makes this pattern particularly prevalent in modern dating is how digital communication enables men to maintain emotional connection whilst avoiding the psychological triggers of physical presence and real-world commitment. Jung wrote about how the anima, a man's unconscious feminine aspect, seeks connection through fantasy and projection rather than genuine intimacy. Dating apps, texting, and social media provide perfect vehicles for anima projection, allowing men to fall in love with their fantasy of you rather than engaging with your actual presence. He can maintain the illusion of deep connection through late-night phone calls and romantic texts, whilst avoiding the psychological challenge of integrating you into his real life. This is why you might notice him becoming more romantic and available when you're physically apart, but withdrawing when you're together consistently. Modern hookup culture has actually intensified this psychological split by normalizing emotional unavailability as masculine strength. Men learn to compartmentalize sexual attraction, emotional connection, and commitment as separate experiences rather than integrated aspects of mature love. Jung would recognize this as a fragmentation of the psyche, where different aspects of romantic experience are kept in isolation to avoid triggering unconscious fears. The man who can be deeply intimate with you physically whilst claiming he's not ready for anything serious is demonstrating this psychological compartmentalization. He's literally unable to integrate his sexual, emotional, and commitment capacities because doing so would activate his unconscious terror of engulfment. Social media reinforces this pattern by providing constant reminders of other options, feeding the unconscious fantasy that commitment means missing out on some better possibility. The cruel irony Jung identified is that men with this psychological structure often choose women who are genuinely available for real partnership, then systematically sabotage the connection because their unconscious cannot tolerate what their conscious mind desires. They're attracted to your emotional maturity, your relationship readiness, your capacity for genuine intimacy, precisely the qualities that terrify their unconscious mind. This creates a psychological trap where they pursue you because you represent everything they consciously want, then withdraw because you represent everything their unconscious fears. If you find yourself repeatedly attracting men who seem perfect on paper but can't follow through emotionally, you're likely dealing with this specific psychological pattern. These men aren't necessarily narcissistic or deliberately cruel. They're psychologically fragmented in ways that make consistent emotional availability impossible. If you've ever felt like you're dating two different people, the warm, attentive man who emerges when you're relaxed and not expecting anything, and the distant stranger who appears the moment you express normal relationship needs, you've experienced what Jung called anima possession. In this state, the man is literally possessed by his unconscious feminine aspect, which seeks connection, but cannot tolerate the reality of an actual woman with needs, boundaries, and expectations. You might recognize this pattern. He's most romantic when you're sick and vulnerable, most attentive when you're upset about something unrelated to him, most loving when you're clearly not focused on the relationship. His unconscious feels safe expressing care only when you're not in a position to reciprocate or expect consistency. Perhaps you've noticed how he becomes uncomfortable when you express normal relationship emotions. Excitement about spending time together, disappointment when plans change, happiness about relationship milestones. Jung observed that commitment-phobic men often interpret positive relationship emotions as pressure because their unconscious associates enthusiasm with entrapment. Your joy about the relationship becomes, in his unconscious mind, evidence that you're trying to trap him, even though you're simply responding naturally to emotional connection. This is why conversations about the future, discussions about feelings, or expressions of relationship satisfaction often trigger his withdrawal. His unconscious mind reads your emotional investment as a threat to his psychological survival, creating the maddening dynamic where showing normal human emotions pushes him away. The most painful aspect of this pattern is how it gradually teaches you to suppress your authentic emotional responses to preserve his comfort. You learn to downplay your feelings, avoid expressing excitement about spending time together, and carefully monitor your emotional expressions to prevent triggering his withdrawal. Jung would recognize this as a form of psychological abuse, not because the man intends harm, but because the dynamic systematically invalidates your emotional reality. Over time, you begin questioning whether your relationship needs are excessive, whether your desire for consistency and growth is unreasonable. This erosion of emotional self-trust is one of the most damaging effects of loving someone who cannot integrate their psychological splits. If you recognize this pattern of gradually diminishing your emotional expression to accommodate his discomfort, you've experienced the psychological cost of uncommitted love. Jung's most crucial insight about this dynamic is how it creates what he called mutual unconscious attraction. Women with specific psychological patterns are unconsciously drawn to commitment-phobic men, and vice versa. If you repeatedly find yourself attracted to men who can't follow through emotionally, there's likely something in your own unconscious that needs integration. Perhaps your early experiences taught you that love requires proving yourself worthy, that emotional availability equals weakness, or that you must earn affection through patience and understanding. When you meet a commitment-phobic man, your unconscious recognizes familiar territory, the challenge of winning love from someone who cannot freely give it. This creates an addictive dynamic where his withdrawal triggers your pursuit, feeding both of your unconscious patterns. The woman in this dynamic often carries what Jung called the savior complex, an unconscious belief that love means healing wounded men through patience and understanding. Your unconscious interprets his emotional unavailability as a puzzle to solve, rather than information to act upon. You become focused on proving that you're different from other women, that your love is sufficient to heal his commitment fears, that consistency and understanding will eventually win his trust. Jung recognized this as a form of unconscious grandiosity, the belief that your love has the power to transform another person's deep psychological structure. This keeps you invested in relationships that cannot grow, whilst preventing you from seeking partnerships with men who are already psychologically available. The tragic reality Jung identified is that this dynamic often involves two people genuinely seeking authentic love, but trapped in unconscious patterns that make real intimacy impossible. The man isn't commitment-phobic because he's selfish or immature. He's protecting a wounded part of his psyche that learned love means psychological death. Similarly, you're not too demanding or needy. You're responding to mixed signals that would confuse anyone seeking emotional clarity. The unconscious attraction between these complementary wounds creates relationships that feel intensely meaningful, whilst remaining fundamentally stuck. Breaking free requires recognizing that you cannot love someone into psychological wholeness, just as they cannot think their way out of unconscious terror. Both people must do individual shadow work to transform these patterns. The solution Jung proposed isn't about changing commitment-phobic men or developing strategies to make them commit. It's about integrating your own psychological shadows so you stop being unconsciously attracted to emotionally unavailable people. When a woman does her shadow work around love, worth, and relationship patterns, she develops what Jung called conscious choice in romantic selection. This doesn't mean becoming cold or calculating. It means recognizing unconscious patterns early and choosing not to invest emotional energy in relationships that cannot grow. A woman who has integrated her shadows around love can remain warm and open whilst maintaining clear boundaries about what she will and won't accept in partnership. Jung emphasized that conscious women naturally begin attracting conscious men because psychological wholeness recognizes psychological wholeness. When you're no longer unconsciously seeking to prove your worth through patience with unavailable men, you stop radiating the energy that attracts them. Instead, you begin attracting men who have done their own psychological work, who can offer consistency because they're not battling internal wars about intimacy. This shift happens naturally as you develop what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the ability to love without losing yourself, to remain open without sacrificing your standards, to offer care without taking responsibility for another person's emotional limitations. Conscious relationship means understanding that someone's inability to commit reflects their psychological capacity, not your value as a partner. The transformation involves recognizing that your attraction to commitment-phobic men often stems from unconscious beliefs about having to earn love through suffering, patience, or exceptional understanding. Jung observed that many women unconsciously believe that easily available love isn't valuable, that true partnership requires overcoming obstacles and proving worthiness. When you integrate these shadow beliefs, you naturally begin valuing relationships that offer genuine partnership rather than psychological challenges. You stop interpreting emotional unavailability as mysterious depth and start recognizing it as information about someone's relational capacity. This consciousness shift literally changes your romantic magnetism, attracting men who are seeking real partnership rather than unconscious healing through relationship drama. Jung's final insight about commitment-phobic relationships is that they serve an important psychological function. They reveal unconscious patterns that need integration before conscious partnership becomes possible. If you've experienced this dynamic, it's not because you're attracted to bad boys or have poor judgment. It's because your psyche is seeking to heal specific wounds through repetition and eventual consciousness. The pain of loving someone who cannot commit often catalyzes the shadow work necessary for attracting genuine partnership. Each experience teaches you more about your unconscious patterns, your relationship to worth, and your capacity to choose conscious love over unconscious attraction. The key is recognizing these relationships as learning experiences rather than failures. When a woman integrates her shadows around love and commitment, she develops an internal radar for psychological availability that operates below conscious thought. You begin recognizing the subtle signs of commitment phobia, the man who's eager to share his feelings but vague about future plans, who's intensely romantic in private but uncomfortable with public relationship acknowledgement, who discusses deep topics but avoids practical relationship conversations. This awareness allows you to make conscious choices about investment rather than hoping unavailable men will transform. You can appreciate connection without losing yourself in potential, enjoy romance without sacrificing your standards, and maintain openness without accepting inconsistency as normal relationship behavior. The ultimate empowerment Jung identified is the ability to choose relationships based on actual compatibility rather than unconscious wound attraction. A woman who has done this psychological work doesn't take commitment issues personally because she understands them as information about someone's internal landscape rather than evidence of her inadequacy. She can feel compassion for men struggling with these patterns without sacrificing her own relationship needs or trying to heal them through love. This consciousness creates space for partnerships with men who can match her emotional maturity, who seek commitment because they've integrated their own psychological splits, who offer consistency because they're not battling unconscious fears about intimacy. True relationship empowerment means choosing partners who enhance rather than challenge your emotional well-being. Which of these patterns resonates most deeply with your own relationship experiences? The hot and cold behavior, the fear of your emotional investment, or the unconscious attraction to unavailable men? In the next video, we'll explore Jung's insights about why some women unconsciously choose emotionally unavailable partners and the specific shadow work required to break these cycles permanently. Remember, understanding the psychology behind someone's behavior frees you from taking it personally and empowers you to make relationship choices from wisdom rather than wounds.